Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thulani Dube, and I'm from Cornerstone. I'm the head of innovation and advancement. I would just like to welcome you all on behalf of Cornerstone and COMESA. This will be our first critical dialogue for 2025. The critical dialogues have stood as a platform for thought leadership and a way to engage with communities and different industry stakeholders. And we hope that as we explore this particular topic of traditional recognition, especially of the Khoi and San, it will not only spark critical debate, but also add value and impact going forward. And I think it speaks to our values as a institution that's rooted within the community, that has its values in social justice, and that's also a non-profit organization playing in the academic space. I will hand over to Dr. Ncebakazi Mnukwana, who will introduce the panelists, frame the topic, and lead the discussion from there. Just also as a quick announcement, apparently I'm meant to announce where the bathrooms are. I just found them myself, so I should just know that. Through that door, down to your right, the ladies' one is upstairs, the gentlemen's one is ladies upstairs, gents downstairs. Then I'm hoping that after the engagement, we can also mingle, get to know each other, build partnerships. Doc.
Good evening. Thank you for coming and thank you for spending time with us. My name, as you've heard, is Ncebakazi Mnukwana. Our title for the critical dialogue is Indigenous or Aboriginal Traditional Recognition, and what are the implications for the Khoi and the San in that recognition of the post-apartheid era. With me in my panel, in my far right, I have Tariq Mellet, Professor Nigel Penn, and Ms. Analise Kotze. I would just like to make some opening remarks with regards to this discussion tonight. The first one, I've got 3 points to make. And the first point I want to make is about storytelling and family intimacy. That we share stories when we are in safe spaces, but our memory is not safe. Yet this memory leads us to trauma, and somehow we trauma bond. The second point is tradition and innovation. And when we say tradition, do we symbolically move away from tradition, or do we find new things that create what has been tradition and what it is that we believe in? The third point, which we in Xhosa they would say sizawugxila kuyo, is democracy and inclusivity, where we think of cultural visibility from a school library to the shows we have in our theaters, to our dress code, and all the other subcultures that we explore and experience. And in that, where is the development of indigenous languages for academic use, and the politics of recognition, where we talk of individual autonomy and collective identities. Who do we put first? And as we cry and cry, where do those tears go? I hand over to you, Mr. Tariq Mellet, and you can share some points. Each panelist will make a statement, and from there we will take on the discussion. Thank you.
Nice, if you want to just bear with me, I'm not too well. And instead of rambling, I've actually prepared something. And we also have a limited time. So our subject is framed as Indigenous or traditional, implications for Khoi and San in the post-apartheid South Africa. And my approach in post-apartheid South Africa is to focus on what I call restorative memory, as I deeply believe that without restorative memory, we cannot craft restorative justice. For me, indigeneity of the San and the Khoi are also a part of our continent's indigenous African family of peoples, rather than a standalone curiosity people or the European notion of the exotic noble savage on the periphery of humanity as propagated by colonialism. That is not debatable. The term traditional is a debatable term that has different meanings to different people, depending on the outlook and ideology. It involves adherence to long-established customs, values, and protocols handed down from generation to generation, involving beliefs and behaviors. For me, the framing of indigenous versus traditional is less important than what I call addressing invisibility and distortion. And this is what we inherited from colonialism and apartheid in 1994, invisibility and distortions. And it's still what we are wrestling with in the post-apartheid South Africa. My personal mission in honoring our Khoi and San ancestors is to uncover the hidden, the invisible, and to address the false and the distorted. And addressing what I call the lies and the truths, addressing the boxing in of the past. And my books, The Lie of 1652 and The Truth About Cape Slavery, as well as other writings, focus on these issues. In the public space and public consciousness, the preoccupation of contestation about indigeneity, primacy, firstism, nationalism, for me is a distraction and a preoccupation rooted in a set of overlays of colonial thinking about the Khoi and the San. For me, the real challenge is about shining a light on the history, heritage, culture, legacy, spirituality of a people who have been subjected to stereotyping, exoticizing, marginalization, dispossession, ethnocide, and genocide over time. It's about recognition and drawing the curtain from what is hidden. It is a focus on restorative memory and ensuring that the question of who are these people, our ancestors, getting fair exposure and tribute in the present. And there are many different ways that we can do this. In doing this, we would be right-tracking restorative justice, restitution, and reparation, and focusing on redressing the legacy in the present of dispossession, not just for a few who organize themselves into revived formations, but for the many descendants living with poverty, economic exclusion, social exclusion, ghettoization, backyard dwelling, homelessness that may belong to an organized group or may not belong to an organized group, or may not even be interested in joining organized groups. It is about justice for all, relegated to the underclasses in our society where marginalization and discrimination is most strongly felt. So I just wanted to share 4 points of perspectives on celebration, emphasis and championing of Cape Indigenous identity, and then 4 points of where I diverge, areas of disagreement. And so my first starting point is my personal journey. I have a pride in the diverse array of ancestors and cultures that contribute to our identity. I have pride in my Khoi ancestry as part of my broader Mzansi identity. Along with my Khoi ancestors from 3 different Khoi societies, I also have ancestors from India, from Southeast Asia, and from Europe. I have pride in knowing who they are and what they did in their lifetime. So this, for me, what I'm sharing is, it's the the starting point in identity is getting to know your ancestors. In this context, one of my maternal great-grandmothers, that's my mother's granny, was Francina Dampis, and her father and her mother, my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were all from the Damascua people in the Eastern Cape. Francina Dampis married a British man, and my grandmother and her siblings were raised in Hala in the Eastern Cape. And then on my father's mother's side, she's a direct descendant of a woman from the Khoisan in Tulbagh, and I'm descended from two of her daughters who married Frenchmen, and they are my fourth and fifth great-grandmothers. In my fifth great-grandmother's baptism record, she's recorded as Kaitia Odendoten. So when I also look even further back, one of my great-grand-aunts 8 generations ago was Krotoa. So my DNA and my recorded genealogy speak to this ancestry along with my other roots. I celebrate this. It's a really extremely important part of my life. I bring up my grandchildren to understand that too. So I do as much as I can to learn about the culture, the spirituality, the history, the legacy of what I call my Khoi Foundation people. Along with those ancestors, I also have San ancestry from the Foundation people, and from the third Foundation people that we don't talk about in South Africa, the Kulundu Rewe. I also have a reverence for that lineage. We have 3 Foundation peoples in our history and heritage. Then, secondly, I reject the imposed colonial and apartheid label of colored, and even more so, in my case, the label of other colored. You know, we had 7 categories of colored in those days. This term was introduced for the first time formally in 1904, and then it was part of the first census carried out in 1911. I note that what happened with the formation of the Union of South Africa was that 2 silos were set up. Now, you know, we often talk about our rejection of the term colored as an imposed term. What people don't realize is that the terms Xhosa, Tswana, Sotho, Pedi, Venda were also imposed terms. There were hundreds of societies, African societies, and people were forced into these different silos in a de-Africanization process. So it wasn't only people who were classified colored who were subjected to forms of de-Africanization. It was all African societies in South Africa. Then also part of our ancestry, if we go back and we look at what happened in 1904, they still, in that census, mentioned all the different groupings. Then in 1911, suddenly there is natives, coloreds, and Europeans, and all the other groupings go. But there were groupings, for instance, who were forced into the colored silo, called Musbikers, Kru, Sintolinians, Chinese, Indians, the Namakwa, the Damara, Yildamara, the Rikwa, the Cape Hottentots, as they call them, and the Bushmen, Turks, African Americans, Caribbeans, Arabs, etc. Our little museum here, the COMESA Museum, points out 195 roots of origin of people who were put into this silo category called colored. So one of the things that I note too was that 25%, you know, if you go back and you look at the figures between 1885 and 1904 for what they called Hottentots, and you see a lot of variation. But you go then and you look at the, you know, because it breaks down into the different areas that people were, most of them rural areas. You'll find that what actually happens is about 25% of the Khoi people are reclassified as Xhosa, as Tswana, as Sotho, because people were sharing the same townships. And we don't recognize this in our public discourse. So we note in 1904 that there were 92,181 who self-identified as Hottentot. and 4,181 as Bushmen, and then 303,000 plus who identified as what they called mixed other, this combination of groupings. I mention these things because they're important in how we tend to reflect our past in shorthands. So, for instance, sometimes you will have some people say, well, the colored people are the Khoi and the San. And that is not quite true. Many colored people do have Khoi and San heritage. But then suddenly Xhosa and Sotho and Tswana and Venda and Ndebele and so on, if one knows the history of the Khoi and the San is not a Cape history. It goes right up to Angola, to Zambia, to Tanzania, Mozambique. And we tend to think about our Khoi history in terms of the 17th century in the Cape. But there's a much older, longer history there. So I further celebrate my Khoi heritage through research, writing, and teaching others about the history and heritage of the Khoi and its many dimensions. And I look at our three foundation peoples. I avoid this term First Nations, and I'll explain why. First of all, the first foundation people are the Aboriginal people, the San. Then there are the Khoi pastoral communities, and then there are the Kuliturewe cultures. And over time, these mixed. Now, when we go back and we look, we can track back the Khoi cultures for 2,100 years. The San culture begin many thousands of years. And the Kuliturewe peoples, we have two theories that jump out at us. The one is based on archaeology, which traces the Kuliturewe to about 1,800 years ago. But in modern DNA studies, it suggests 3,000 years plus, because there are three San peoples who do not have the DNA predominantly that is found in other San people. So the Kum, the Khoi, and the Chua, their DNA is predominantly sub-Saharan DNA, which is associated with Bantu-speaking peoples. So our history is a lot more complex than we think. My focus is to bring the invisibility, the hiddenness of our marginalized Khoi and San culture, history and heritage into the open and onto center stage. In this context, I fully support the United Nations, the African Union, the International Labour Organization, and our own South African Human Rights Commission adoption of recognizing that the Aboriginal San, as well as the Korana, the Nama, the Griqua, and the Cape Khoi, are indigenous people in South Africa who have faced marginalization and discrimination by other dominant indigenous African societies and by European colonial and apartheid authorities, past and present. It is extremely important to understand this statement and not to confuse it with overlays that say something very different. And I've heard different interpretations of this. This is what the actual documents say. Now, the 4 points of challenge and departure that I have from some trends within the discourse on Cape indigenous identities. Firstly, I do not subscribe to the concept of firstism and primacy. And I note that the UN, the AU, the ILO, and the South African Human Rights Commission also do not endorse the concepts of claims to privacy and First Nationhood. They fully support what I previously said about the marginalized and discriminated indigenous groups, the 5 groups. Only the surviving San micro-communities of people are recognized as having ancient Aboriginal roots. All others arrived later, but that later period is between 3,000 and 1,800 years ago. It is not recent times, as colonial history tries to project. I argue that the South African tendency by some to misuse the global term First People is harmful to the cause of the recognition of the San and Khoi, of their just claims. Now, for instance, in Canada, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Latin America, other places, when people use the term First People, what they mean is all of the peoples in those territories that existed there before the Europeans colonized. There's why they are first. It is not about primacy, and it's not about one group saying that, indigenous group saying that they are more important than another indigenous group. It's a very important thing to understand. The apartheid type divisive distortion of the term first people in South Africa falls into the realm of racist ideology, in my opinion, which suggests that those classified black or Bantu, and in some cases used erroneously Nguni, as having only arrived in the 14th century and 15th century, or only arrived when Europeans arrived here. It's complete nonsense. It's not borne out by historical facts. The notion that South Africa was an empty land and only a few people who were, in the Europeans' opinion, half people were here. And therefore, the Europeans, in fact, were the first in their way of thinking. And then we've adopted that. We've tried to now say, well, that the Europeans were right, that the black people were alien invaders and only the Khoi and San were first. It's not historically factual. And one has to understand where that history comes from. Even the Europeans didn't argue that until the mid-19th century. And they argued that during the time of the so-called frontier wars, as part of their justification of the dispossession of the Khoi and the Xhosa people's land, they then tried to come up with these firstist theories. Mary Barber, William Holden, George McCall Teal, these historians. Mary Barber went as far as talking about she was actually a self-schooled person, but is considered to be the mother of anthropology in South Africa. She talked about the Bushman people as being just one step up from the relative swinging in the trees. That is the way they talked about people in those days. Now, while I support the struggles and the identity of the San and the Khoi peoples, I question and reject the German zoologist turned anthropologist, Leonard Schulze-Jenner, who in 1928 created the word Khoisan. There were never any people who ever called themselves Khoisan. It's a European anthropologist, zoologist word. And he created this during the genocide against the Kung people and the Nama people in Namibia. Terrible genocide, where he was doing experiments on San and Khoi people, cutting off their heads and sending 300 heads to Berlin for experiments. This is the man who creates this term. How can we be proud of that term? They are the Khoi and they are the San. And each have their own histories. Each have their own languages, cultures, and so on. And the San are not an appendage put behind the name Khoi. They're people in their own right. And they exist in 6 countries across Southern Africa, in tiny communities, about 25, 28 communities, and number about 110,000. We cannot dispossess them of their history and their heritage and their identity. So we have to be very careful how we use words. Now, when I also look at the issue of genocide, I talked about the genocide in Namibia, but we had much genocide and ethnocide in South Africa. And the San people were victims of genocide by the Europeans, by the Orang Afrikaners, by the Tikwas, by the Cape Khoi. All committed genocide against the San. We need to be honest and open about this and address this because it's important for our own cleansing and our own heritage. Then I also don't believe in the overlay of a unique queer social organization, political culture, and heritage with European or West and East African monarchy cultures. Our queer culture and heritage and San culture and heritage was not monarchy heritage. And one can look at pastoral peoples across the world, indigenous peoples in Asia, in Latin America, Africa. None have monarchy systems. They have their own unique systems. We talk our neighbors in Namibia, where the Khoi are well organized, as the nuns. They elect their leaders. It's not hereditary, and it's not monarchy. And they have their own name. They don't use kings and priests. They are house if they're male, and they're house if they're females. And they have councils of elders, flat structures. Why do we have to mimic West African cultures or European cultures when we actually have a culture of our own amongst the Khoi and the San that we ought to respect? And then again, we tend to use this word tribe willy-nilly. It's an insulting term. It's a European insulting term. It's nothing to be proud of. And once we buy into that, we buy into the concept of tribal fiefdoms. And that too is alien to our indigenous culture. So we can learn a lot from our Nama brothers and sisters in Namibia. They've achieved much more than we have as the Khoi in South Africa. You go to Namibia, the banknotes, who's on the banknotes? Is Hendrik Witbooi. The Nama have their own schools, their language, their television stations, the radio, newspapers. They elect their leaders. They are so much more advanced and together and not disunited like we are. We can learn from them. Let's be humble and learn from them, because they have certainly got a formula. And it's a formula. They're not opposed to the other Namibian African brothers and sisters. There's no conflict there. Why do we have all of this conflict here in South Africa? We need to address that. I'm coming to the end of my lollipop here. Then I really do not believe that indigenous Africans practiced apartheid. What do I mean by that? I don't think that over the last 2,000 years, people didn't intermarry, cross different lines of clans and social groups. Most of the names that we have today in South Africa are about 600, 700 years old at most. There were other names before that, and other names before that. And societies evolved one from the other. And I can tell you that every African society in South Africa today has Khoi ancestors, has San ancestors, and has Colonial ancestors over time. And DNA proves that. If we go into like traditional genealogy, like Isiduko, you will see again that there's a group called the Amaskochis, because there was a Scotsman involved. There's the Abelungu, the Amangolo, Amamala. When we start to look at this, there are 10 Khoi peoples identified amongst the Isiduku clan names of the Amakosa. The Thulukwembe are a mixed Khoi Xhosa people. So this notion of separateness that somehow or other has been brought into is Thabundian. It's ethno-nationalism. And we need to be extremely careful that we are not sacrificing our culture to nationalisms, because they are very dangerous things. I want to just kind of finish off by saying that when the UN, the AU, the ILO, and the South African Human Rights Commission, they do not support that kind of interpretations of nations, First Nationism, and they are talking more about heritage, cultural self-determination, restorative justice and redress, establishing equal rights for all by addressing discrimination, and ensuring economic measures are put in place to address marginalization. So reparations and restitution is what makes up restorative justice. This should benefit poor, deprived descendant communities who are homeless, live in apartheid ghettos, backyard dwellers, street people, people facing mass unemployment and locked out of participation in the economy, facing marginalization and discrimination in their daily lives. This is where our focus needs to be with restorative justice and with celebrating our Khoi and our San heritage. we have to be very careful about boxing in our memory to the mid-17th century to the mid-18th century. In other words, to talk about our history and heritage as something that is totally tied to the colonial project of the Europeans. There's a history before 1652. There's a history after the 18th century. Time did not stand still. Different things happened to peoples. And we're also going to be careful about mimicking what we see in European writings about the Khoi and the San.
Thank you, Patrick.
Okay. Stephen.
So as we talk about our ancestry, I think most of us who sit here, the question that we should have in the back of our minds is our spirituality. How do we hold the space with the space that has been so tarnished and so brutalized? How do we get back to the place where we love ourselves, even if some of our ancestors came off a boat on the Eastern Cape Coast? How do we love ourselves? How do we understand when we go to the doctor and they tell us the diseases we have from our genealogy? Those are the things that we live with. I hand over to you, Professor Penn.
Excuse me, ma'am. Is it possible to reach with the first speaker before we go staying the notice?
No, Dada, just write it down. Write it down.
Yes, I brought it.
A voice note.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for that wonderful, wide-ranging, comprehensive introduction to which I don't think I can add really very much. I agree with about 98.2% of what you've said. And we can have a discussion about the odd 1 or 2% that I don't agree with you, but I completely applaud what you've done, and there's no point in me trying to repeat all the things you've said, and there are many, many cogent points that you've made that I agree with. So what is it that I can actually add? Well, firstly, I should perhaps express my gratitude to be invited to address such a meeting and to acknowledge my inadequacies in being here. I know a lot of people are probably asking, why is a white person sitting here? Why is a white academic sitting here? What can he possibly tell us? We don't want to know anything from such a person. So let me say that you're quite entitled to that point of view. I'm not here to tell you what to do, to preach to you. Perhaps I'm only here to try and explain my own interest and trajectory in my field of studies. And I can only think that if I have been invited here, it's on the strength of things which I have written, and in particular, the book called The Forgotten Frontier, which deals with the impact of colonial expansion on the Khoi and the San societies of the 18th century Cape. And that book was the book of a historian, or for some reason historians always refer to an historian rather than a historian. It's a pedantic little speech tick. So what is it that an historian adds to the narrative, the story of the indigenous people of South Africa? I think that what historians do, in a nutshell, is they talk about the past. They explain the past. They elaborate and make visible what was lost. You made reference in your introductory speech, Patrick, to restorative memory. And I think that is what historians do. They bring back to the consciousness of present people that which was lost or has been forgotten in the past. And this is a very, very important and a very necessary process that was very, very necessary to happen to the Khoi and the San.
When I started my book, it was in the 1980s, but it started life as a PhD thesis. It took me about 10 years to write, one of the slowest PhDs in history. And then it took another 10 years for that book to be published. So it was a book about, you could say, about 20 years in gestation, and a lot changed over the process of writing and the reception of that book. But one of the things that book did, I believe, is bring to the attention of the reading public and those who are interested in history, the presence, the historical presence and the historical experience of Khoi and San people. And one of the things my book emphasized was that it exposed the violence perpetrated by white settlers, not only white settlers, as Patric mentioned, but other societies and population groups on the colonial frontier. It drew attention to the incredible violence of that frontier and the violence committed against the Khoi and the San in the process of the historical expansion of the colony. And I remember back in, I think, 2002, when Henry Bredekamp was starting his crusade to reassert Khoisan identity, to make Khoi and San people proud of their identity and aware of their history. He said to me, it was at a conference at Oudtshoorn, I think it was after the day's proceedings, propped up at the bar, when tongues are a bit loosened. He confessed to me how important Richard Elphick's book, Kraal and Castle, had been to him. Richard Elphick, an American historian, wrote this book which portrayed the Khoi at the Cape who confronted the first Europeans, including Van Riebeck at a later date. Elphick portrayed the Khoi as historical actors, as agents, as people who are capable of having a history and acting within history. And for Henry Bredekamp, this was incredibly important. It was inspirational. And that was 2002. And I have to say, there have been many other historians who have written about Khoi and San, and many historians have attempted to combat what a recent book calls the attempted erasure of the Khoi and San. In fact, reading that book, I'm very conscious of the attempted erasure of historians who have written about the Khoi and San. Not enough credit, and here I'm sort of promoting the profession of historian, not enough credit is given to historians in resurrecting the Khoi and the San past and their heritage. And people like Robert Ross, Shula Marks, Susie Newton-King, Candy Malherbe, to name just a few of the historians who've labored in the field of bringing the history of the Khoisan before public and historical readership. Now, historians don't just recover the past. I suppose they attempt to interpret it. They highlight things. They, in particular, if you are, I suppose, of a Marxist persuasion, you're inspired by the English Marxist historians to attempt to recover the lost history of the forgotten people of history, those people which include the great majority of humankind who didn't actually make it into the history book. People like the downtrodden, the oppressed, the laboring class, enslaved people, and we can add to that list the colonial subjects. We can add to that list, I suppose, even until recently, women, and a whole category of oppressed people. So historians try to rescue these people from what E.P. Thompson called the condescension of history. And historians try and complicate the narrative. They tell inconvenient truths. And you, Patric, were making some points which I believe were probably quite inconvenient to some of your listeners. The complexity of South African history is quite staggering, and no simple grand narrative is going to do justice to it all. And indeed, the complexity of Khoisan history and the frontier history of South Africa is extremely complex. One of the odd features of South African history, believe it or not, was that compared to other settlers of other colonies of colonial settlement, there were relatively very few whites compared to other colonies. At a stage when there were about 20,000 white settlers in South Africa, there were about 20 million white settlers in America. So that the sheer demographics of, if you like, the flukes, the realities of historical settlement have a huge influence on the way history unravels. And on the South African frontier, this relative absence of whites led to a great degree of intermarriage, miscegenation, hybridity, you might say, whatever word you want to use for the mixing of the different races and people. Also, the fact of the South African or the Cape frontier is not just the fact that a hybrid society emerged in the crucible or the cauldron of the frontier. Side by side with this was the presence of, this was a slave society. There were many, many enslaved people in the Cape and in South African history. And there was a uniquely close relationship between the indigenous people of the Cape and the enslaved people. This has already been touched on. And I would suggest that any consideration of the history of the Khoi, the history of the San, and the present situation in South Africa must take into consideration the very close relationship which existed for centuries between the Khoi and the San, or the indigenous people and enslaved people. And we see this coming to the fore in the 19th century in particular, where the slave uprisings in the Cape are better characterized as being slave or Khoi uprisings rather than simply slave uprisings. And we see this even after the abolition of slavery in the very close relationship which developed between people of indigenous descent and slave descent in the farms, in the rural working place, on the mission stations, and indeed even in urban areas. So that is a complicating factor which has to be taken into consideration. When you think of a settlement or a colony of white settlement like Australia, where perhaps only 3% of the population now is of Aboriginal descent, you can see the massive, I suppose, toll that white settlement took on the indigenous people of Australia. And this brings me to another point which makes historians perhaps valuable to this debate. Historians can bring to the discussion about South African indigenous identity a comparative dimension. We should also be aware of the examples of Australia, New Zealand, North America, and I'm involved in a book which is seeing the light of day at last after many years later on this year, called Empires of Violence, which compares 4 different case studies of the impact of the expansion of the colonial frontier on 4 areas of European expansion during the revolutionary period. These areas are Australia, South Africa, North America, and it might surprise you to know Europe, where a chapter or a part of the book looks on the influence of French colonial expansion on the populations of Europe itself. The French tried to colonize Europe, and they treated many of the European subjects, for instance, Italians and Spanish, as Europeans were treating non-European subjects in the colonial world. And one thing that all of these societies had in common, all of these frontiers of expansion, was the use of massacre and violence. Massacre sometimes shades into that that area that we call genocide or genocidal studies. Very often, many massacres perhaps make up a genocide, but once again, to complicate issues, we should be aware in South Africa that sometimes massacre served the purpose not just to commit genocide, but to force subjugated people into becoming a laboring underclass on the farms in the rural areas of South Africa. So violence and massacre is not just about ethnic cleansing, it's also about creating a subjugated labor force. And of course, the history of the Khoi and the San, particularly in the 19th century, after perhaps the massive massacres of the 18th century are over. Not that massacres stopped in the 19th century, of course, but the history of the 19th century is perhaps a history of the experience of subjugated Khoi and San laborers who are being forced into the trekboer or the capitalist economy by force and violence. And this is one of the areas in which further research is needed. And if I can just once again quickly stress what historians do. Historians preach, in a sense, that you cannot turn the clock back. Into the same river one cannot step twice, said Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. Once something has happened, you cannot make it unhappen. And a lot of history is like that. There can be no return to a pre-colonial past. There can be no return to a world without capitalism, colonialism, and Christianity, the three great C's that transformed the world. Not just colonies, but for colonialism, capitalism, and Christianity transformed the entire world. And looking at these themes, these great themes, you cannot set the clock back. You have to adjust to living in a world shaped by these massive forces, which didn't just affect South Africa, but other regions of the world. And I once again go back to thinking about Henry Breer de Camp at this first sort of Khoisan consultative conference in 2002, where he insisted that, I said, why are so many of the delegates here wearing church uniforms, choir uniforms? And he said, well, it's because they came from mission areas, mission settlements, and it's at the mission settlements that the Khoi languages are best preserved. But he said to me, the Khoi are a Christian people. This might be a contentious statement, but it is not a statement that can be ignored. It should be, I suppose, explained and explored. The 21st century is a different century to the 18th century. In conclusion, let me just say how being a historian or historical concerns can illuminate or suggest concerns for the present. I certainly stand with Patric, whatever the terminology may be, that the Khoisan should be recognized as an indigenous people at the very least, and they ought to be recorded the respect and the rights that are given to indigenous people all over the world. Having said that, they should also be recognized, the diversity of their composition should be acknowledged, and one should not expect a politically unified indigenous movement ever throughout history. Indigenous people met the challenge of colonialism in a variety of different ways. One moment they were collaborators, the next moment they were resistors. The same figure can be both a collaborator and a resistor. In the end, what counts is a strategy which enables the survival and the continuity of a particular group, a particular heritage, and a particular way of life. And so this is what should be concentrated on, strategies for the survival of indigenous culture, but in the context of the 21st century, there can be no going back to a hunter-gatherer way of life. There can be no going back to a predominantly pastoralist economy in the Northern Cape, for instance, or in Bushman land. I think that any future solution for the status of the Khoi and the San as indigenous people must confront the past injustices that were done to them, the massacres and genocides that they were subject to. There has to be a narrative that puts these atrocities full square in the public eye. And this is very much what happened, for instance, in Australia. The Australian nation was basically forced by its historians to confront the horrific realities of the process of colonialism. And whatever the outcome for the Aboriginal people of Australia, the work of historians has made it certain that the Aboriginal presence cannot be ignored. And the same work has to be done and continue to be done here. Finally, if we come to the subject of redressing past injustices, some people might be thinking, what sort of compensation or restoration am I talking about? I would caution against the idea that land restoration is the answer to all the ills of the past. Things are very different to what they were in the past. As early as the year 2003, the majority of the South African population became urban. In fact, 58% of the South African population were urban dwellers by 2003. There can be no going back to the country. There can be no going back to a rural lifestyle. This is the route to poverty and to failure. The solution for restorative justice for people of Khoi and San descent is to try and equip them for a life in the 21st century whilst maintaining their heritage, preserving and with a huge emphasis on education, educating members of the communities in their language, their past, and their culture. So I'm not suggesting how to do this. I'll leave that to other people. But I will end now by suggesting that we must keep in mind the past and the injustices of the past if we hope to rectify and to find a new role for people of, well, the indigenous people of this country in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you. So as we ponder on the external forces and what history teaches us, in a sense, you said something very important about religion, culture, and people. And as we sit here, we know what's happening in the Vatican, but what is the impact of the Vatican all these centuries? How have we become the people we are through baptism? Okay, I hand over to you, Analise, to touch on the lived experience and your work with working with people of Indigenous heritage. Thank you.
Thank you for the Institute also for inviting me. When I saw my fellow panel members, I was just like, what am I doing here? Seriously. I work at the museum. I can't call myself a historian. These are the people that I read in order for me to do my job. So yeah, very honored to be able to be here and also to sit amongst these great people and all of you here as well. So yeah, I work at Iziko Museums and I was very happy that Professor you brought up Henry Bredekamp was such a huge ambassador for what we do at the museum. And our oldest museum, the South African Museum, is 200 years old this year. So you can imagine the history and the legacies that we have to deal with as a museum today. But so among the artifacts and the ancestral echoes, there's a deep reckoning that is underway in our museum, one that challenges us to uncover hidden memories and to bring to light the invisible histories that continue to shape our nation. I'm constantly reminded that the museum is not only a repository for people's histories and their objects, but a dynamic site for dialogue, a place where science narratives demand presence and power. So as you can see, mine is much more practical. This is my everyday. So yeah, at the heart of this reckoning is the complex and often painful struggle for the recognition of the Khoi and San, whose identities have long been obscured by colonial narratives and post-apartheid oversights. So my personal journey started with I delved heavily into it with my thesis. When my thesis was about the formulation of cultural identity in Khoisan and colored people. And why this topic? For the simple reason was Heritage Day. What does a colored child wear on Heritage Day? And that time there was no internet, there was no TikTok, there was the encyclopedia. And what I learned in the encyclopedia was not very positive, let me tell you. So I chose to include the term colored because it's the term I grew up with. I included Khoi and the San for the reasons of finding out who they were, what was the difference between a Khoisan, a Khoi person, a colored person, and what I was taught at school, like I said, wasn't very positive. So it was by talking to many people about their identity, providing them a space to talk about an ideology that I realized many, but not all people, they didn't know who they were. You know, many of us assert firmly, I'm a colored, or I'm a Khoi, or I'm a San, or I'm a Bushman. You know, but there's also historical pain and trauma that comes with asking a question like that. You know, if you ask someone, who are you? How do you identify yourself? It's uncomfortable because that is something that you have to deal with yourself first before you can tell someone outside. And the thing is just that even when someone asks you, when you come into a room, people already identify you. They already classify you just by the way you look. So from that vantage point, at Iziko, I witness daily how deep legacies of marginalization still pervade the institutions and narratives that define our collective memory. For decades, Khoi and San identity was filtered through external lenses. The Khoi and the San people were othered, they were studied, the objects were collected, they were collected, and the way that they were portrayed and displayed in our museums was very negative. And the post-apartheid democratic transition marked a profound shift in our nation's socio-political landscape. And this also happened at Iziko so before it became Iziko, it was different museums, but Iziko then became the umbrella. And we had to deal with a lot of perpetuated racist ideologies, such as displaying European objects in a cultural history museum, but Indigenous objects in a natural history museum with plants and animals.
And you know, happen.
So this also happened with a lot of the people that found themselves miscast under the imposed label of colored, a misleading term that erased Indigenous identity in favor of racialized classification. This conflation not only disconnected Khoi and San descendants from their roots, but also rendered their cultural and their land-based claims politically ambiguous. I use the term miscast very deliberately here because in 1996, Iziko actually did an exhibition called Miscast, which was about the negotiating the presence of Bushman people. And it particularly used the word Bushman. So this was followed by many vigorous engagements with Khoi and San communities, and it changed the way the museum not only perceived and displayed Khoi and San people's cultures, but also made a concerted effort in including their voices in spaces where they were seen as nothing more than objects to be studied and othered. So the tensions with the Additional Khoi and San Leadership Bill was hailed by some as long time overdue. It was formal recognition, however, for many within the Khoi and San communities, the act remains a double-edged sword. On one hand, it aims to acknowledge the existence of the traditional Khoi and San leadership structures that are historically dismissed or destroyed by colonial and apartheid regimes. However, a lot of people, like I speak to a lot of people in Indigenous communities, and even though they feel that they're getting recognition now, a lot of the people are saying, one, that it's long overdue, and what happens now? What happens after the things are now approved? How does this practically affect us? So the tension reveals the deeper question: what constitutes legitimacy in post-apartheid South Africa, and who gets to define it? At Iziko, we are increasingly aware that museums are not neutral spaces. They are powerful platforms for engaging with reimagining identity, history, and belonging. We are very honest about our role in society, about racist perpetuation and outdated information we have provided in the past. We are very much aware of the role of a museum. And you know, when people come to, let's say they come to Cape Town for the first time, the first place you're going to besides Robben Island, Table Mountain is a museum, because you want to learn about the cultures of that area and of that place. And as a museum, if we are giving out the wrong information, we are displaying that information as if it's the truth, you know. So this is why it is so important for us to be able to not be this all-empowering, know-it-all institution, but to be inclusive. To uncover the hidden is to engage directly with suppressed histories of dispossession, pain, trauma, and resistance. To reveal the invisible is to listen deeply to those who have been systematically silenced, not only by apartheid, but also by post-apartheid policies that fail to account for Indigenous specificity. I think here of two stories that particularly moved me while I was doing my thesis research. And one was a woman, she was about 65, 70 years old, and we were talking obviously about identity, and she spoke about how during the apartheid struggle, she was an activist. You know, she was out there, she was throwing stones, she was that girl. And I asked her then, how did you identify yourself? And she said, I was Black. But now I don't know what I am. I don't know who my people are, how do I identify myself? And for a woman of that age to be sitting, and one question I asked her is, who are you? And that made her cry. And that just goes to show the trauma that people still have to face on a daily basis. But the thing is that they don't always know that they need that space to talk about that trauma. So recognition, therefore, cannot be reduced to legislative gestures. It must include reparative justice, land restitution, language revival, cultural representation, and candid teachings of the past. And here I want to bring in a second experience that I went through, and it was, I spoke to primary school children about my thesis, and I asked them, are you colored, are you Khoi, are you San, what are you? And then the whole class was like, no, I'm colored, I'm colored. And then 3 students put up their hands and they said, no, we're Khoisan. And they were laughed at. And I asked him, why are you laughing? And there's one boy, you know, there's always that one child in the class. And he's like, that person is a Bushman, they are ugly and they have krusara. This was what this child was saying in this day and age. How is that different from what I learned in primary school? So for museums, this includes that we need to open up governance structures to Indigenous voices, rooted in ethical collaboration, confronting our own institutional complicity to this, and co-creating narratives that honor the depth and the diversity of Khoi and San identities. In this evolving landscape, the museum's role is not to declare who is Khoi and San, but to support platforms where people can declare themselves. It is important opening up our collections to the communities we serve, and especially the marginalized communities, having open and honest discussions about what we have, why we have it, and making decisions together as to what to do with our objects that we have. It is about having frank discussions with children in museum spaces and having them question the histories that they are taught in school. You know, having them come up in the rock art gallery and seeing the lantern panel and knowing that that monarchy that's there on this rock art panel is in the coat of arms. They don't even know that. And to know that that is their ancestors that did this, it gives them so much pride in the history that they're not necessarily reading in the books. So recognition then is not a destination, it's a process. It's rooted in justice, accountability, and reimagination of what it means to belong in a post-apartheid South Africa. In doing so, we move beyond symbolic inclusion and towards a more honest and transformative reckoning with South Africa's past and its future. The path to recognition is not only about asserting visibility. It's about reshaping the terms of engagement, redefining heritage, imparting generational knowledge, and restoring dignity to those for whom the nation's founding narratives have long failed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Analise. And Analise touches on her research on Heritage Day, reimagining history, identity, and belonging, and the deep listening that you've all been doing today. And we're going to keep on listening because this is our future. And you also touch on the storytelling and the intimacy that, in fact, where is the respect learned about our country's diversity? Can we still learn it in our homes? Or our children judged for the things that they overhear that we say as adults in the home? I'm going to open the floor and give our panelists a break. Give them a round of applause. Show them some love. Do we have a roaming mic? We're going to take some questions. We'll take 2 questions. We've already got a gentleman. We've got your first question. Yeah, and then we will take about 3 questions. If you want someone, I recognize you. If you want someone specific, he's number 2, he's number 2, number 3. Number 1 over here, please.
Sorry, number 1 here.
We ask a question. If we want a specific answer from someone, we say that. Otherwise, we address it to the whole panel. We've got 3 questions. We'll take the first round. Hopefully, we'll have about 3 rounds or 4 rounds. So keep your questions to the point. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the first speaker, I hope I've got your name right. I know it is a French pronunciation at the end, a Muslim one in between, and whatever for us.
Also, there's the mic that.
It is right here for me. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you to the first speaker. Your rejection of the term colored, I find it the term abhorrent. Okay? Can you just elaborate on this term? And post-independence in South Africa, BEE, and then triple B, double E. Black economic empowerment, broad-based black economic empowerment. And this, if I may, with the indulgence of, to take a step back, when I and fellow students or learners in South Africa wish to attend UCT, we did not get admission because of our academic achievements. We, including myself, had to go to the Coloured Representative Council for a permit. And how many people know about this? The Coloured Representative Council, where I was asked, what am I? I said, South African. No, that's too broad. I'm black. You're obviously not black, sir. Don't call me coloured, please. And then we have the release of the icon against apartheid, Mr. Nelson Mandela, addressing the people on the parade from the city town hall. And he referred to us as coloureds. I walked away. Mr. I can't forget your name.
Mellet.
Mellet, Mr. Mellet. How do we take this terminology, colored, which you reject and I find abhorrent, into a current situation, specifically within those two terminologies, Black economic empowerment, which later on became broad-based Black economic empowerment, and it excludes other than Black. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Over there to you, Thulani.
Musa Valia. I've got two questions. It's with regards to language. Number one is in 1936, the last hunting permit was issued in Pretoria for a Hottentot couple because they refused to identify as colored. And that is how people were forcefully re-registered as colored. The other one is, and that's also how people lost their languages. The other one is in 1963, with the advent of the Bantustans, places like Ciskei and Transkei had loads and loads of Hottentot people who had farms, businesses, homes, factories, you name it. They were thriving communities. It was then told you need to either reclassify as Bantu if you want to keep your businesses and your schools and whatever, or if you want to stay. That time people were colored. If you're colored, you pack up what you can and you move away. So all these people that's so proud of the Transkei and the Ciskei, you moved into homes and to businesses and to farms that was taken away forcefully. 1913 is the last time that land restitution or expropriation bill was whatever. Why not 1909, when the Colored Land Trust was established by the British, that gave the entire South Africa back to the indigenous people, but it's not recognized. Once again, people's language got lost because of this forceful removals. And their identity got lost and their heritage never spoken about. It's always about die arme Bantus wat seer gekry het, maar nie die breinman nie. Die breinman, hy moet net daar wees, suffer in silence. No, it needs to end now. We need to tell the truth. The truth is going to hurt for a while, but falsehood is going to hurt for forever. So people need to stand in their spaces and they need to start saying, I'm here, I speak the truth, and I stand for the truth.
Thank you, sir. Thulani Snomto up.
Where we, yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to ask a question about the constitution of the panel. It's very interesting that I don't.
Sorry, in my Kerko.
Yeah. I'm just very interested in the panel, the people that you put together to come and talk to us here this evening. I've become, a few years ago, now Nigel knows I went to see him as well at the university. I became very intrigued by the archaeology, the archaeology of the country. And I see these archaeologists as almost like the ghost of academia. They're there and they somehow impact on your talks, and you guys, the academics who write the papers around historical papers and so on. When I came, now, say 15 years ago, I went to have a look around myself. I thought, to hell with these people. And I'm going to go out and go and have a look around myself. And what I subsequently discovered is basically develop another head. I've got two heads. It's the impact from the discoveries that I've made. It was shocking. Yet these things are not in the public domain. It's opened my eyes. There's ways of seeing. Somebody once read a book called Ways of Seeing. I don't want to go into that. But we are lit, and I said to a friend, listen, you're basically looking into oblivion. When I look at you guys, I walk around, I can see you staring, looking at oblivion, into oblivion. There's a world out there, an astonishing world that is here, right at our feet. Yet nowhere do I see these archaeologists coming up and out and coming to sit on these panels and talk to us about what they have discovered out there. There are maybe heaps of literature around what they have discovered. I've also engaged some of them in the country, and I was shocking by how what I sensed from them, what they their responses to me were shocking and at times profoundly patronizing. Extremely, from the head of the archaeology department who says to me, "Sir, I hope you don't go around there and dig." I looked at the guy in total astonishment. Who the hell are you to tell me something like that? I didn't say anything. I just looked at the guy. I was astonished by some of the experiences that I had in my interaction with them. And so maybe, hopefully, next time I come to a chat like this, which involves the museums here, which involves, and looking at these things, that hopefully we will have somebody from the archaeology department, whether they're from Wits, and they've got a big one here. They've got somebody at Stellenbosch University as well. But you see them nowhere. They're nowhere to be seen in public. They literally operate as ghosts, and they impact hugely, enormously on what their impact on what we think and how we imagine the world will be a revolution, basically, will be completely revolutionary.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just quickly add, while I'm sitting right next to the mic? My question is my comment is for Tariq, and maybe to hear your view. You speak about that pastoral indigenous peoples didn't have a monarchical system. It was the way that you describe it was a flat democratic system in which people were chosen for their skill, for their ability to lead particular areas of the society. And yet in contemporary South Africa, we witness the political opportunism, the political exploitation of our, what did you call it? The distortion of memory. And I wonder, we all witness this. Everybody's a chief. Everybody's a princess or a queen. Nobody is enslaved. Nobody are just ordinary people. And so it pains me because it's obviously been exploited, and I think that the last speaker spoke about the Traditional Leaders Bill, if I'm not correct. And so those are red flags when we speak about restoring our memory. But I wonder, our communities, our societies, black society, everybody who's not white, has experienced such deep scarring and pain that resonates across time. And I wonder if that hankering for a kingship, a tribalship, even though you hate that word, if we cannot recognize that maybe our people need to believe in their identity beyond what was just labeled. So I'm constantly in tension with this thing about that those are colonial labels, but our people are so in such pain. Maybe they need a king or a queen.
Thank you. We will start on this side with the term colored, and then you can cover also the other questions that are directed to you, Patric. By the mic.
There's a lot of, it's quite a lot of diverse questions. It is exploding with all of the issues. I think the first thing is to say, like I am, and I don't think any of my fellow panelists are here to tell people what to believe and how to believe in things at all. We're here to just, in a sense, share our journeys and our experiences. When it comes to the question of expertise, I left school at the age of 15 and went to work in a factory for 10 rand a week. And I subjected myself to lifelong learning after hours and never ever went full-time to university. Yet I've written 12 books and I've done a lot of research, and ultimately in my 40s I got a Master of Science degree by distance education. So I'm saying that so that we don't overblow the importance of educational formal qualifications and so on. And here we're talking as community-based historians and archaeology, I love exploring that. Coming to the issue of colored. This term arises in the mid-1800s. It's a British thing. And the British start off by talking about the British South African colored people. What they were doing was they were using the word colored in the way that we use the term black, or non-white, or non-European. So everybody, whether you were Xhosa, Sotho, Tswana, whether you what they called mixed other in those days, whether you were Griqua or you were Khoi, or if you were San, everybody that was not a European was a British colored. That's how the term starts. As the 1800s progressed, towards the end of the 1800s, there becomes a differentiation between, and it's still informal, between what they call natives and coloreds. And it's only in 1904, in preparation for the Union of South Africa, that a census committee sits in Pretoria. And they are dealing with what they call the native question. And this native question that they're addressing is, they're presented with a problem because there are actually over 100 African societies, and there are over another 50 African societies that fall outside of this lexicon of Bantu language speakers. And so they decide at the census committee that there will be 3 categories of South Africans. Europeans, and although the Europeans have many different nationalities, they are all just Europeans. Later on, they changed the word to whites. They then take all of the people that speak non-Bantu languages. All of those Africans who speak, for instance, Kwadi, or various San languages, or languages based on the old Malayo or Afrikaans, Afrikaans, and they ring fence those people, and they say these people are now going to be called colored. And amongst those are the Griqua, the Nama, the Damara, the Korana, the San, the Masbikers, the Kru, a whole range of people are put into this category. But they ring fence a few people. They ring fence the Chinese, they ring fence the Indian, and they ring fence what they call the Malay, the Cape Malay. This then progresses. In 1950, they decide that they will create 7 categories of colored. So from 1950, nobody was actually called colored. You were either a Cape colored, whether you had even seen the Cape or not. If you were sitting in Durban or Joburg, you were a Cape colored. Then there was a Malay, then there was a Griqua, then there was an other colored, me. And then there was a Chinese, and then there was an Indian, and then there was an other Asiatic. So there was these 7 categories of people called, in an umbrella sense, colored. But then there was a National Party member that hated Indians. He hated Indians with a passion. And he decided, his name was Ibn Donges. And Ibn Donges decided there needs to be a separate category of Asians, of which Indian, Chinese, and other Asiatic should be separated as a silo. So then it left 4 categories of colored. That's a small pen picture of the white European thinking. But underneath that thinking is something called divide, conquer, and rule. And that's where it all starts, back under British rule. Under Dutch rule, they had a classificatory system as well. There was Europeans, but they didn't use the word Europeans. They used the word Christians. They were Christians, and then there were free blacks, and then there were company slaves, then there were private slaves, and then there was what they called Hottentots. That was the classification system until the British came.
The British then, for a few years, wrestled with all of this and then came up gradually with this thing of natives and colors. Now, the whole problem with that and our universities, by the way, are founded on this. The universities had no money originally. And they did a deal, UCT did a deal with the union government to help them address what they called the native question. And that is how the Department of Anthropology developed at university. What was the term they used? The ethnography, became this big subject. And in fact, for many years, they taught a subject called criminology and ethnology, where they put these two elements together. So there's a lot of ugliness behind the term colored. It's insulting. It is, as you say, what was the word you used? An abhorrence. It is absolutely abhorrent term. I can't see how anybody can be proud of it. Now, in my family, we were a mix of white or Europeans, Indian, and colored, or mixed other, they called it initially, and Khoi, my great-grandmother. And so now comes 1950 with all of this stuff, and we are all colors of the rainbow, ranging from fair, pasty complexion like mine, what you call pigmentationally challenged, to rich, dark, black hues in the same family. Blonde hair and blue eyes to dark chestnut eyes. I mean, we were us. We were a family. And then comes this thing. And it caused terrible things. There are people in our family to this day who don't talk to each other because we fell into different categories and things. My cousin Busy, we called him Busy, his name was Herbert. He was very Indian looking, very dark Indian looking. But he had a European card. So he kept on getting into shit. Because, they said you're an imposter, and whatnot. So he went to what was then called internal affairs. And he said, you can shove this European card up where the sun don't shine. I'm not walking out here until you give me a colored card. Not because he was wanting to be colored and that label, but because his life was made a misery because of this European. So then they said, no, but you need to go to this race classification board, control board. An humiliating experience. When I got 16 and I went there and I put in colored, they laughed at me. They said, what's your game? What are you trying to play, booty? He said to me. I said, no, that's why I'm saying I am. I'm not saying it because I think it's a wonderful word, but I don't want to be put there as a European. What? No, don't come with that shit game here with us, You need to go see the race classification board. I said, I'm not going. My cousin went there and he told them, shove that card up there where the sun don't shine. All of that pain is there. It's a human experience, and we reject it. When we were youngsters, we developed a consciousness called black consciousness. It wasn't about the degree of your pigmentation. It wasn't about Indian colored, and at that time they used the term Bantu. So they moved from native to Bantu. And then when the youth uprose in 76 against Bantu education, P.W. Botha came up with a smart plan. And he said, these guys, they have this unity term black. Let's turn the word into an ethnic term, black, and use it instead of Bantu. And so they manipulated people. Terminology is important. It's been a history of manipulation. Bernadette? Yes. That wasn't you, sorry.
My name is
Alva. You made a number of statements which I can only agree with, rather than me repeating what you were saying. I think that there is a whole range of issues that we wrestle with. I think people, in their search for identity and for dignity, they are aiming as high as they can to be able to run away from the terribleness that they've been subjected to. So it isn't a matter of standing in judgment. But when I talk about us needing to avoid this route of going down the monarchy thing. It's from a critique of what comes with that, because that doesn't offer us liberation. And as much as I'm proud about my queer heritage, my heritage amongst African, Asian enslaved, I'm also proud of it. The white working class poor that dare to cross the line and marry across I'm proud of all of that. I'm not ashamed of having come from poverty. Poor people are my people as much as the queer are my people. And it's all of these. And I like, what you talk about in terms of the spirituality of all of this. Because this is not just an intellectual thing. It's a deeply emotional subject that we talk about. It's a spiritual thing. I take out time. Every day I have something before I go to sleep, ultimately at the end of the very often 1 o'clock in the morning. I do an exercise called the remains of the day. And in the remains of the day, I think about these things. I talk with my ancestors. I try to get to know them in a really personal way, and I write about them. My grandchildren, I sit them down on occasions. We do little ceremonies. We burn khanakau, mpepu. We pray and show reverence to our forefathers. All of this is part of the subject that we're talking about.
You see,
and
for
it's
me,
all about making it visible.
Yeah, but I come from the place where we were dispossessed as the Mbondomise people through the Judge Hamilton in the 1800s, where he went to Mhlonhlo and Mhlonhlo attacked him, and the Mbondomise people, we lost Sulenkama, Tsilitwa, the whole of Qumbu, right up to Tsolo. And only now, with uMatiwane coming in and being made king, we come to know that actually who we were, and that genealogical line that's written by Usoga, we can say, okay, my parents come from this line, my mother comes from the Chezi clan, and that is why we are here. But also spiritually, that is why your grandfather has to go and be hidden and live and grow up somewhere else. So it's in one place, some cultures, they want that identity back. They want the history of the monarchs. And it's not only monarchs, it's actually, there are royal councils. With the Xhosa people, we have Ukumkani Ahlangene, but we have the royal council that can even override. So yes, there is the ceremonial king, but there are judgments that are made in the crawl. There are issues where people don't go to the police or go to court, but go to the king, right up to today, that we need the monarch. I want to come to you, Nigel, and we have the question of 1936 and 1963.
Can you refresh my memory?
So it's a comment and partly a question, sir, when you talk of the loss of language, but the hunting permit, and then the Bantustans come in, and how then we get the communities that you found a lot in Lusikisiki, Port St. John's, moving down to the Western Cape, but they are also integrated in those societies. And they essentially grew up as Xhosa people of Pondoland. And the whole East Coast, when we talk of the East Coast and Pondoland, Mzimkulu, Pongolo, Amabhaca, Matikane, all of that, if you have a comment on that.
Well, I don't really have a comment because I don't really know very much about the 20th century in Bang. But what I would like to just add is, yes, of course, group areas and separate development and racial classification did have a profound effect, of course, on people's identities, shaping and confining it. I'd also just like to make the comment about the word coloured, that it sort of came into vogue really after the abolition of slavery in 1838, when it was necessary to find a blanket term to describe both people of, then they were called Hottentots and ex-slave descent. Up until 1838, there had been perhaps a distinction in the mind of the census takers anyway, between the Hottentot and the slave. Then the Khoi are sort of semi-liberated by Ordinance 50 of 1828. They're given the right to move around, freedom to seek employment, not such a great freedom in the long run. But the Khoi were liberated to an extent politically, socially, and economically by Ordinance 50 of 1828. And they used this opportunity to move around, to exercise mobility, to either seek for employment on farms, to go to mission stations, or to seek employment in the towns. And then came abolition of slavery in 1838, and suddenly the landscape was filled with vagrant ex-slaves or enslaved people. So you had a category of Khoi and enslaved people moving around the landscape who had to be, as it were, corralled and contained and classified by the state. And increasingly the word coloured comes into usage to describe these two particular population groups.
Thank you. You thought. Yes, whichever you like to understand first. Okay.
We'll talk about the hidden memories and identity beyond labels. She's gone now, but the thing is that with the bill that's coming out now, people, even if you get the title of this, you don't have that title alone. It comes with people. Who are you representing if you're saying that I'm a chief? If you're saying that I'm this and I'm that? Who are you representing? Who are you protecting? Who are you guiding? And the thing is that it is because of the trauma. If I get this title, what does that do to me? What memory, what identity does that give to me? I'm a chief of what? I'm a king of what? Because you need to be elected by a community. You need to be elected by your people to be able to represent and to guide them. And it is the mere fact that our histories, besides the fact that it was distorted, our memories also need to be reignited and reinvigorated again so that we can know who we are and where we come from. And I also just want to touch a bit on the archaeology thing. It's actually very ironic.
Actually directed.
Okay. So ironically, I actually went to go study archaeology just to find out why. One, how their brains work and why they make the decisions they make. And they're brilliant. The discoveries that they make, when they go on these, I was excited. But the thing is that it's the same like having an academic discussion. We talk to each other. We don't talk out in the public domain. And this is why I am very privileged to work where I work. Because not only is it archaeological studies, it's all these trips. Captain Cook's mask is there, for goodness sake. But the thing is that they don't get into the public domain. And that is why it is important to work where I work and to have researchers do the research and the histories so that it can come out into the public domain.
Can I just cut in here with a word of support for the archaeologists? Somebody like John Parkington has devoted his life to trying to publicize his work and producing accessible, cheap and popular publications, especially about the San and Khoi and rock art. So not all archaeologists are sort of hermetic academics who live in caves and speak to each other.
Thank you. We're going to take a last round of questions. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. All protocols observed. Sometimes we need to contextualize things if we want to not go back into history. So I want to say thank you to the speakers for the cyanide lollipop. But when we're dealing with a non-responsive government, then whatever conversation we're going to have and we have been having is going to go absolutely nowhere. When we talk about this, what we're busy talking about, it's a crime against humanity. It's not only just happened in South Africa, it's a global phenomenon through colonialism. And so when they sat in the Berlin conference and they decided which of the areas of Africa they're going to colonize, the colonialist playbook come into play. The phenomena is not only in South Africa. And the people that's perpetuating and supporting them, unfortunately, is the United Nations. So when you see what's happening in Palestine, issues around land, we see the issues in New Zealand also about land for the Aboriginal Indigenous people. The land issue in South Africa will also come up once again, and it will never be addressed because you have a non-responsive government. So thank you very much for the opportunity. We can have beautiful speeches, and let me say, I've had many of them already. In actual fact, I used a vehicle for the restitution of an equality court claim against this government for the so-called colored people as a vehicle to educate our people. For 2 years we've been doing that just as a form of educating people of who they really are when they are still thinking that they are coloreds. Now, in that educational program that I do, in the segregation in America, they also had where the whites could go into the front of the shop, and at the back of the shop they had a board and it was written, coloreds. And who went in at the back of that shop? The African American Negro. Are you the same as that? So wherever the colonialist wants to differentiate from themselves to the other, the label of the colored is being used. There's no ethnicity attached to it. It is a derogatory term. And these things are not in any of our educational school system. In the other African states, you might find some of these things being educated and taught. And that's why when you find the foreigners coming into South Africa, they don't understand why we are not dealing with the issue because they have been educated on it and we haven't. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good evening. This isn't question, it's just one discussion point that I would like for the panel to elaborate on. 1A is ethical considerations for researchers and historians to contemplate, especially taking into account that all of us as individuals have implicit biases, and more often than not, the implicit biases of any form of a researcher, whether academic or community researcher, the implicit biases more often than not leads to narrative bias. Then 1B is the empowerment of narrative authenticity amongst Native people, especially in authorship and publication. Because at the end of the day, until the lion, which is the Khoisan word for lion is kham, or as we are called kham, until the lion learns to write, the story of the hunt will always be told by the hunter.
It seems like I'm going to be talking a lot. Just another point of contention is Khoi is actually a language. It's not a people. It's Kwe Khoan. So they've termed everybody that speaks a similar language under the term Khoi or Kwe. And there's no such people as Khoisan. People need to get that. That's a made-up term, as Brother Tariq said there. It was made up by Leonard Schultz in 1926. So we need to get to the point. It's the same like the term Bantu is just because of the language group. All the black people is now Soma Bantu. So we need to get back because it's Hottentot, the natives, the Hesapqua, the Ataqua, the Outeniqua. We need to learn all these clan names. It's very important. Like we learn, there's a Scotsman, there's a British, there's a Welsh, there's a French. I mean, even though those are also language terms, but we know where they come from, who they are. So, you know, the respect needs to be given back to us. To be
Thank
nice.
you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. And that's where we arrive at our politics of recognition, which was the whole point. Yes, of course, we still need more work needs to be done. And as you rightfully say about archaeology, and that's when the Tao, the lion, needs to write its own history. It's happening in Zimbabwe, where people are going into Great Zimbabwe as Zimbabweans, unearthing what has happened in that kingdom. But if we don't have those politics of recognition, then it will be lost. All of it will be lost. And that's where then the restorative justice, when we talk of healing memory, the things that come out in our dreams, the visions we have, the languages that we speak, we don't even understand, but we have those people in our genealogy. We're not going to be ready to confront that spiritual life. And it's going to visit us. And it's going to keep visiting us because that spirit didn't die with the sword. I would like to invite you for some eats before they dry up. And you've been a wonderful audience. I think it's going to be available on YouTube. It will be available on YouTube soon. And I hand over to you, Ms. Elise.
Good evening, everybody. Just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, Patric, Nigel, Analise, and Ncebakazi. I work for the COMESA Museum, and we hosted this event in partnership with the Cornerstone Institute. Thank you very much for choosing us. The COMESA Museum runs with a volunteer team who supports me day to day. We have a donation box in the catering section over there. And the team is just at the back at that door. Thurston, Jaden, and Shagan. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
So we can do it.